All right, guys. So we are back with part two with Nicolas Verhoeven. Part one was last week. As I mentioned, there are a lot of dense information there, a lot of quality to go through. So we wanted to break it up into two parts. So welcome back, Nick, and we'll get into part two here. So speaking of fats in general, you had a good video somewhat recently on fish oil and oxidation. And I really like to see you touch on that because with fish oil, you see these comments all the time where, first, like the studies are like, hey, eating fish a few times a week seems to correlate, with better health. And then there's also a lot of talk other than just oxidation. There's a lot of talk about like farm raised fish versus, wild caught. And, if it was wild caught or farm raised, like, what goes into that and coloring and whatnot. But strictly speaking on fish oil itself, a lot of people get worried about this oxidation if it's exposed to air, if it's exposed to heat, if it's exposed to sunlight, and like there's all these specifications on how you have to keep your fish oil. So you just want to talk about that in general. I guess one, what health what health benefits are purported with fish oil, and then two, is there actually a big concern with how it's stored and oxidation?
Yeah, sure. The fish oil literature is pretty robust. So there's been quite a few studies on fish oil and just omega-3s as a whole, just so I don't trigger the vegans that
Yeah,
sometimes like to
yeah.
say, well, you don't have to be sourcing this from fish, which is a fair point. Hey, look, I don't disagree. So I'll just say omega-3s as a whole, but the most common source has been fish oil. So yeah, fish oil has a ton of studies in relation to cardiovascular disease to indicate that it's beneficial towards myocardial infarction, which is heart attacks. It's been beneficial in relation to MACE, which is major adverse coronary or cardiovascular events, and a bunch of different metrics. Cardiovascular death, it decreases cardiovascular death. So it has tremendous benefit in that regard, considering that it's just a supplement or it's just the consumption of fish if you want to go with fish consumption instead. The other benefit that I looked at actually first because I wanted to branch away from the cardiovascular disease aspect because that's been actually covered quite a lot. Like Dr. Rhonda Patrick has covered fish oil and or omega-3s and cardiovascular disease a good amount. So I looked at brain health as well, and it does seem to have some pretty good evidence in relation to its effects on the brain, mainly because, or one of the main reasons is because it has your brain has high levels of DHA, which is docosahexaenoic acid, which is one of the omega-3s. So the studies, there's a ton of randomized controlled trials that have been done looking at the effect that DHA, but also just in general, omega-3 fatty acids have on the brain. And there's a small positive effect. It's not massive, but the other thing with the brain, and that you could also sort of apply to the cardiovascular system, but especially for the brain, is that the this is getting a little bit into the science weeds, but if you think about the overall time scale of some of these effects. If you're doing a study for 6 months or 12 months, it's the same for like bone mass kind of studies. You need to you need to have enough of a time scale there to be able to detect an effect if there were an effect. So for these fish oil studies on the brain, if you're looking for mild cognitive decline where a person's mental faculties are, they're not like they don't have dementia or anything, but they're just starting to slip a little bit. It's really difficult to pick that up on a time scale of 3 months
Mhm.
because the difference between 3 months ago and 3 months later is potentially, if they weren't on fish oil, there might be no differences. Like, but on
Right.
the other hand, if they do a study 5 years, now you might be able to start picking up, and that might be too short too. Like by comparison to if you did 20 years, now you're really talking, okay, now I can definitely tell the difference between if I do a test at one point and then 20 years later in that same person, you might really be able to tell, okay, there's a big difference there. So just the fact that fish oil and that the fact that these studies are able to detect a difference, that fish oil does benefit the brain and the brain's function, and that's usually more specific to memory. It also has a small effect on executive function, which is a particular type of like critical thinking ability, which a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist could probably explain that better than I can. But it's so those two metrics get a very small bump, a small improvement. Now, the reason why I'm explaining this timescale thing is because the studies have been done up to about 6 months, maybe 12 months in duration. I think maybe there are a few that are 2 years long, which is really impressive for a randomized controlled trial because
Yeah.
that's really difficult to do. It's very expensive. And they have detected effects. So I wonder if the effects might continue to compound where a person maintains their cognitive function over time, while a person who doesn't take fish oil continues to see these decrements, that over 10 years, 20 years, fish oil starts to have these really impactful effects on your brain. So that's one aspect. Fish oil seems to help. The other aspect is cardiovascular disease. I've touched on that, and it kind of follows that same principle overall that over time you see greater and greater effects. And I will say omega 3s probably have a greater effect on your heart, benefits for your heart than for your brain, but there seems to be a benefit for both. And I haven't looked at some of these other organ systems. Maybe there's some other, like maybe I'm assuming that you've probably discussed this before with omega 3s. I have not looked at this, so I'm going to throw it back at you and then I'll continue with the rancid fish oil.
Yeah.
Omega 3s on hypertrophy, so actual like muscle growth and whatnot. Have you looked at any of those studies or discussed that any?
It's been a while. There was one podcast and maybe one video like way back on it. My understanding is there's not a strong, I mean, obviously there's not a strong effect. Are you familiar with like a small effect there?
No, I haven't looked at that research at all. I just know that Dr. Rhonda Patrick uh, has mentioned fish oil in that context before,
I think
but
when
I
it
haven't
comes
I haven't
to
actually looked at it.
Yeah, I think there was a study or two that discussed it. My thoughts on something like that are, you talked about how maybe with brain health, for example, it's a compounding effect over time. And I think when it comes to almost any supplement and hypertrophy, there is not a lot that's going to be compounding. Like I even wonder this with creatine, which has more evidence than almost anything. Is creatine causing 1% more growth this year and 1% more growth the next year and 1% more? Like probably not. I doubt that. I would think that probably there's like an initial little bump and then you maintain that little bump. But I don't think that like 20 years of creatine versus no creatine and then some at the end is going to be that different. So anyway, if there is any effect on fish oil, I would imagine it is a small initial bit, and then that's about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. With the yes, I haven't looked at that literature, but there are other areas where fish oil is being investigated or omega 3s are being investigated on these different outcomes. So one of them is on muscle hypertrophy. Hopefully, I'll look at that at one point. But brain health and cardiovascular health, there seems to be pretty strong evidence that it benefits. Now, then people will say, well, if I report on a study that doesn't show an effect with omega 3s, they'll often come back and say, well, it was probably because they used rancid fish oil or all fish oils are rancid, all of
Yeah.
them are oxidized and whatnot. And then people will take it a step further and say, well, that's damaging to your health. And I had heard that many times. So, and I did not know the answer because I mean, mechanistically kind of makes sense, right? If you have oxidized fish oil, you're taking these damaged fat molecules and you're consistently consuming it, yeah, maybe it makes sense that you would have some sort of inherent problem with that. Your body would somehow react to that over time as it builds up. But there have been shockingly few studies that have looked into that. And there have been several studies that have looked into the number of supplements that are rancid or oxidized, but there are very few that have actually looked at the health outcomes. So let me pause there real quick and think about the number of times I've heard it many, many times, and it seems like it's like growing in popularity, this idea that fish oil is like oxidized and rancid and it's causing
Yeah.
all these health problems. If we pause right there without even revealing the results of these studies, the fact that we only have two studies or three studies or just a few studies, and we are this confident that they're having an effect, that should automatically tell you that you probably shouldn't trust these people to talk on really anything health related, because
Yeah.
they're talking right out of their rear end. Because now you look at the actual studies themselves, and none of them show negative effects. I'm not saying, like, in some studies they show positive effects still, and it's possible maybe the positive effect isn't quite as robust as like a perfectly pure omega-3 fatty acid. That's possible, but they either show a positive effect or a neutral effect where there's absolutely zero difference. But none of them that I've seen so far up to now show a problematic effect where there's increase in oxidative stress or increases in inflammation or changes in, like, one study showed dramatic drops in triglyceride levels
Hmm.
from consuming specific, and I'm talking like the researchers made sure that this stuff was highly oxidized. So I'm not that worried about it. But if people are worried, I don't know if you use this website, but Consumer Labs does their own independent testing of
Yeah.
a ton of different supplements. So you can just get it. You can get the testing information from them, and then they'll give you a list of like 10 different ones are that tend not to be oxidized, are good quality, and then maybe you want to source it directly from the company themselves, as opposed to maybe going through Amazon where it's maybe been sitting in a warehouse.
Hmm.
But let me say one more thing on that. One of the studies, when they oxidized their fish oil, they literally took the fish oil and blew pure oxygen onto it for an hour, I believe, for like 4 weeks. Just had to continuously oxidize it just to get it to be oxidized. Then they packaged into the pill, and then they sent it out to for the participants to consume. So
That was an hour
that
a day for 4 weeks.
yeah, it was at least 20 minutes, but I think an hour a day for like 4 weeks or something. It was pure oxygen just
Yeah.
directly applied to this oil just to get it oxidized. So, I mean, yes, polyunsaturated fats do oxidize more easily than saturated fats, for example. But I mean, with that level of effort, I can't
Right.
imagine that if it's sitting in your refrigerator in the dark or whatever, that it's
Right.
just
Right.
like it's going bad in like a week or something. It's just that seems so unlikely to me. And I will say that there are studies, like I said, that have looked at the amount of oxidation in like a range of different supplements. I don't know the names of the supplements, but and there is a minority of supplements that are oxidized to a degree, but they have to hit a certain threshold. It's like, I don't remember exactly what the threshold was, but it was like 20% or something like that of the fish oil was oxidized. So it doesn't mean that the entire product is oxidized, just that some amounts are. So if you're really concerned about it, it seems like you can easily mitigate it. That would be my perspective. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't worry about it in general.
Yeah, it is something that I recommend most people take. I tend to look at like total omega-3 amount because people will talk about, oh, how many grams of fish oil. That's probably easier for most people. But there is a significant variation in the amount of omega-3s per like tablet of fish oil. So you
Yeah,
actually have to
yeah.
check that. And some, there's one like DHA boost or something that's like higher. Normally, you're going to see higher EPA than DHA, but and also, funny thing, somebody was talking about when people do like spray tans and whatnot, the active ingredient is DHA. And there was this whole conversation of like, oh, is that so? It's like the same thing as fish oil, but no, that is a dihydroxyacetone. So
Uh,
smearing fish oil on yourself will not give you a tan, but it is a DHA. But anyway, so yeah, it's just something to look at. I think I have actually to check the number, like the exact milligrams that I take. I think it's under 2 total grams of fish oil, or sorry, two
mm,
total grams of omega-3s per day. But I think for the average person, if you're taking like 2 to 3 grams of fish oil per day, you're probably okay. If you're eating fatty fish several times a week, you're probably okay. It does seem like there's a cap where you're not really getting much of a benefit. Like I remember back in the T Nation days, Charles Poliquin, I don't know if you know him at all. I mean, they were talking about like 18 grams of fish oil a day. I mean, just absurd amounts.
Whew.
But I don't think there's going to be necessarily any harm other than, and I know you discussed this as well. It does seem like there is a legitimate increase in the risk of AFib with fish oil, which is interesting. Still net positive health, for everyone's health, but maybe something to be aware of, especially if you were in a population that already had higher risk of atrial fibrillation. Like, for example, high level endurance athletes, I think can have up to 10 times the risk of AFib. So maybe you could argue don't have high levels of fish oil if you're an endurance runner. I mean, is it a huge risk? Maybe not, but it's maybe something to consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, there is. It seems like there is a risk of AFib, and it doesn't actually. Everybody went crazy about this British Medical Journal study that released maybe a few months ago, where they showed this relationship between fish oil or omega threes as a whole and increased risk of atrial fibrillation, and which is an abnormal heart rhythm for anybody listening in a particular section of the heart that's been deemed as typically dangerous, mainly because it increases clotting risk. So everybody went crazy about that. But then I looked into the literature, and it was an associative study, not to poo-poo associative studies, but it was fine. The study was okay, but yeah, everybody went crazy about this study, but then I looked into more of the literature and I found many randomized controlled trials that indicated the same effect. So this has been known for
Yeah.
quite a while, but for some reason people jumped on this one study and were like, it just, did the social media explosion.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and I think your overall point is exactly right. The overall benefit of omega threes far outweigh any of the negatives because again, even in that study and other studies, even though there is a slight increase in AFib, I don't want people to think like if you take a certain level, immediately it's like a 600% increase or 1,000% increase. It's a small bump in the risk of AFib, but the overall end result is always a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease across many metrics. So I probably wouldn't worry about the AFib aspect nearly as much, and then poo-poo fish oil when you could be getting the overall benefits. And if you do start experiencing AFib and it scares you, like you start feeling an arrhythmia or whatever it might be, yeah, then play around with it, talk with your physician, obviously. Um, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. What I found is that dose seems to matter quite a bit, and that's been talked about in the literature as well. And there's some conflict. I should add that too. Some researchers argue if it actually does cause AFib as well. I think the research is pretty compelling, but I just want to make sure I represent both sides that not all researchers agree that it actually causes AFib. But I think all researchers or most, let's just say 99% of researchers would say omega 3s are a net benefit overall.
Yeah, yeah. So overall, it looks like we're looking at, good evidence for lowering triglycerides, pretty good evidence for heart health, decent evidence for maybe milder effects, but on brain health, and
Hmm.
not a lot of evidence that, it being oxidized is going to be some significant problem.
Right.
Cool, cool. All right. So next topic. So as a dentist, sometimes people ask me, how can I help prevent cavities and whatnot? And one of the things that I mention, if you're already doing, all the basic things, sugar-free gum can actually be helpful. And one of the reasons is that obviously the chewing promotes salivation, which is anti-carcinogenic, but then also xylitol is in most sugar-free gums, which is also anti-carcinogenic. However, I have been displeased to see that I've actually been giving all of my patients heart attacks and greatly increased risk of cardiovascular events. So what have I been doing wrong, man? What's been going on with xylitol?
It's a little bit of a whoopsie on your end.
Yeah, yeah.
All these patients are dropping dead. Whoops. uh, yeah. Again, there was just this study again that hit the social media sphere, and interestingly enough, the exact same researchers did almost the exact same research on erythritol, which is
Yeah,
another one of
I saw that.
those
Yep.
sugar-free uh, ingredients. And that one never made any headlines, but for some reason xylitol just took off. So they did basically the same thing in both studies. And there's interesting studies, pretty well done overall. I think that, mechanistically, they brought up some interesting points. They did try to limit the experiments to doses that were, that we do consume, especially with like ketogenic foods. Like I didn't know this, but apparently a lot of keto friendly meals have a good amount of xylitol in it or
Hmm.
erythritol in it.
Yeah.
So hitting that threshold of I think they went for like 30 grams a day. They showed that if a person consumes 30 grams, that you do see these noticeable rises in xylitol and erythritol in the bloodstream. And then they took plasma from the blood and then did these different experiments where they wanted to see the clotting effect, and they found that there was an increase in clotting from the exposure to xylitol and erythritol, which of course is scary, right? Like you think, oh, wow. And then they had this long-term data as well, where they measured blood levels of xylitol and blood levels of erythritol, and then related that to MACE, which is what I described earlier, major adverse cardiovascular events. So it's basically a composite score of like a number of different cardiovascular diseases. So if you have a heart attack, then that would be considered an event. So you want events to be down, you don't want them to be up. And they showed in a stepwise fashion that, and in an adjusted analysis as well, which means that they try to control for different what are known as covariates. So they try to control for different factors that might influence the results. So even when they controlled for a lot of these factors, we're talking about things like body weight. They controlled for like smoking, blood pressure, things like that, that there was still this overall effect that if blood xylitol levels were high, you had higher rates of these events. So you had greater cardiovascular disease risk. Now, where I believe actually Lane Norton also talked about this, Dr. Norton, where he looked at this study and he mentioned some of the flaws. I think that he kind of overshadowed some of the evidence that I thought was actually pretty decent. But overall, my conclusion from it was that it probably wasn't a risk. It's most likely not a risk. And the reason why I'm going against all this data is because if you look at the population that was probed, especially the people that had the highest levels of xylitol, you look at their actual like health. So if you went to the supplemental material and looked at all the different like health metrics, their body weight, all this stuff, they were definitely worse off. They had greater rates of diabetes, greater rates of atherosclerosis. They just like in general were just less healthy people. Now, I did mention that they controlled, right? They did these covariate analyses, but you have to think to yourself, how much can statistics control for an overall unhealthy person? It's not like you have diabetes in a vacuum, like the rest of your body is unaffected. Like, oh, we're just
Right.
controlling for diabetes, so therefore it shouldn't be an issue. Or we're controlling for smoking, so therefore it's not an issue. No, I mean, the overall body is just so unhealthy that it's basically impossible to control for all that stuff. It's a little bit different when you're looking at overall populations that are like you've got some people mixed in that have diabetes. You can kind of exclude those people and then redo the analysis with people that don't have diabetes. But if the entire cohort, the entire sample itself has diabetes, if like 80% of people have diabetes, and you're controlling for it, I mean, you're not really controlling. It's basically the sample is just like this really biased sample. So my point being that even with these statistical controls, it's basically impossible to then say, oh, xylitol is the reason why these people had this cardiovascular disease. Most likely, what was happening is that these people were just generally unhealthy, and it just so happened that they also have higher levels of xylitol, and that is what was actually causing this cardiovascular disease. And then to quick speak on the clotting aspect, they had determined that 30, I think 30 micromolar was the amount that was like detrimental. Or maybe I believe it was 30 micro. I might be a little bit off on that, but it was some threshold that was easily achievable by consuming, let's say like 10 grams or 30 grams of xylitol. Don't quote me on the exact numbers, but it was within reason. Like again, going back to our doses, if they consumed like one of these like low carb meals or whatever, it would increase their blood xylitol levels beyond this threshold that they were looking at. However, the clotting aspect, when you look at the actual values of the concentration of xylitol, it was at 30. Yes, it started to maybe show an effect, but really the greatest effect and really the statistically significant effect was happening at like 3, 4 times that concentration. So a considerably higher concentration. So even at the doses that people that consume large amounts of xylitol, they still didn't experience like this clotting effect at relatively normal doses of xylitol. So there's a lot of nuance in there, and I think it's definitely something that I'd like to keep my eye on. But so far, this study and the erythritol study do not convince me in any way that both of them are destructive to our cardiovascular health or anything like that. So I'm not avoiding that. I'm not bothered by it. But maybe in the future, as better evidence comes out, I'd like to see that replicated, especially in a population that is actually healthy from the onset. And you compare two healthy populations, one has higher blood xylitol and the other one doesn't. And one more thing too, they're measuring blood xylitol, not the consumed amount of xylitol.
Right.
So think maybe there's something unique about these people because they're so unhealthy. They're producing more xylitol. That's also a possibility because we do produce certain
Yeah, I
amounts
think
of.
that was brought up in one of the papers I had read is that, those who are unhealthy are going to be producing more anyway. So it's almost,
Yeah,
that just, I don't want to say it makes the other evidence irrelevant, but it's obviously something to consider.
it absolutely is. So it's I just wouldn't change my habits based on this study. That's what
Yeah,
it
I
comes
mean,
down to.
sugar-free gum is a huge staple of a lot of dieting bodybuilders for sure.
Mhm.
So maybe that'll be like a quote unquote healthy population to look at.
Yeah, healthy, but then
Yeah.
I'll bet you in the comments, I'm just going to try to predict one of the comments that you'll get is like people die at the age of like 60 or 70 if they're, bodybuilders.
Well, I should say
So
natural bodybuilders. Yeah, not
okay.
yeah, not like IFBB pros for sure.
Okay, okay. Because then, I mean, of course, then you get a ton of different confounders, of course, but
Sure, yeah. So when it comes to the controls and when you're controlling for certain variables in a study, so if you're looking at, let's say, these two populations, and you had, because you were talking about how difficult it can be to control for every variable, and I've seen this discussed in other areas as well. How does a researcher go about that specifically? So if you said, okay, this group there's 100 people, this group there's 100 people, but in this group, 70 people had diabetes, and in this group 30 people had diabetes. How would one go about controlling for that? Are you reanalyzing by removing 40 of the people with diabetes and then comparing, or like to get a similar percentage? Like, what are you actually doing there to quote unquote control for diabetes in this example?
okay, so to be 100% clear, I have not done these controls myself because I'm not an epidemiologist, which is the type of researcher that you would need to do these kinds of controls. That said, I've been super interested in this question. So I actually went to a statistician and talked to him about how they do this, kind of on a kind of upper level. So it's not to the point of depth that an epidemiologist could probably cover this kind of, or a biostatistician could probably cover this. But my understanding is that if you wanted to control for something like diabetes between, let's say, two groups, is that you would be essentially removing those individuals from the analysis in total. You can't, you probably, just from a scientific standpoint, you probably can't just remove like 30 people from, or 30% or whatever the marker was, from one group, because then you're introducing bias, because you'd have to be like, well, why are we including this person? Why are we not including this other person? They both have diabetes. So one, in that scenario, you would just probably just have a greater sample in one group. So you probably wouldn't necessarily have to control between those two groups. But if you wanted to make sure that diabetes was not a confounding factor in that scenario, for either one of these groups, then my understanding, the way it was explained to me, is that you're essentially removing those people from the analysis and redoing the analysis with a smaller sample of just the people that don't have diabetes. So that's usually how it works. Now, I also asked this statistician about like, does that then dramatically affect the power of the analysis? So do you have enough statistical power? Do you have enough data points essentially to run that same analysis? And I was really surprised by his answer. He said, actually, it doesn't make as much of a difference when you're looking at pretty large sample sizes. Even if you were to eliminate like 30% of the sample,
Huh.
apparently it doesn't make as much of a difference. Now, I just want to just bookend this by saying this is not my area of expertise. I understand a little bit about it, but it's something you should probably discuss with a statistician specifically.
Yeah, I just honestly, it's not something I've spent a ton of time thinking about until you brought it up. But just thinking, how many people hear, well, we controlled for this, 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 and this, and we got this results. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean? Like you said, if by control you just mean you're eliminating those people, I mean, how do you control for five different variables that in total 80% of the study cohort have at least one of those variables? I mean, it just seems very, very difficult there.
It does, but you are, my understanding by, and I probed this guy multiple times because it's like, really, it just doesn't, like, that's just how it works. And he's like, yeah, wait, the statistics just separate out everybody by all these different subgroups. Like, do they smoke and they have diabetes? Do they have diabetes and are they overweight? Like all these different, subcategories. Do they smoke, have diabetes, and are overweight? Like you start creating these different groups and you can have like hundreds of them, and then the statistics get applied to each subgroup. So if you wanted to control for like smoking, diabetes, hypertension, overweight, caloric intake, all this stuff, then you would essentially be continuously cutting the group down until you get to a group that's much smaller but has excluded all these different factors, and then you run the analysis on that smaller group. And that's where I thought, like, well, then of course you'd be affecting the power of the analysis. And he was like, yeah, like maybe if you get to super, super granular, you do start affecting it. But overall, it's pretty robust. Like you can cut out a lot of things and still get a very robust answer. So the
And is he
intricacies, the mathematics of that is something that I don't understand fully.
and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but would he say, like, let's say you had a sample size of 5,000 and you did this, you did this, you did that, and you cut it down, and it got to the point that you controlled for six things, and now you're looking at a group of 700 people, right? Is he saying the remaining power would still be greater than if you had just started with 700 people who didn't have those variables, or he's just saying like it would be equivalent to if you started with 700 who didn't have those variables? Does that question make sense?
I think so. So it'd be as if you had just picked 700 people that just fit these criteria, that as in
Yeah,
they
is he
already
saying
have these six things
right? Is he saying the
excluded.
power would only go down to that amount and that's just not a big drop? Or he's saying because you started with a larger sample size that had this really increased power, somehow you're not losing the equivalent amount of power as if you had just started with 700 people.
My intuition is that they are the same, but I'm definitely not sure about
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously neither mine, but it's interesting. Okay, cool. So just one or two other topics here. You had a video on rhodiola, and this is, I mean, I've heard about this since I was a teenager, and it's just never anything that I've looked into. And by the way, that's just making me think, have you done any, since we last spoke, we talked about ashwagandha and there was one other one. Have you looked into ashwagandha at all yet?
No, I'm actually doing that this coming week because
Okay, cool.
I've got an office hour session. So somebody want to in I've got a paid platform and people can ask me questions. And I one of the questions that somebody asked me was about ashwagandha on specifically stress and anxiety. So I haven't done it, but I plan on doing it.
Cool, cool. So with rhodiola, I think you had mentioned that when you took it, you actually noticed like a tangible benefit. So what are the purported benefits of rhodiola and what are the studies show? What is your experience?
Yeah, the purported benefits are that it decreases stress pretty significantly, and that it can help with burnout. That was really interesting to me. So there are a few studies that have looked at people that are really stressed out on a continuous basis. They started taking rhodiola, and their burnout or their overall feelings of stress decreased pretty substantially. Um, I took it, I tried it. My personal experience, because I was taking it during my PhD defense and leading up for like maybe 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that, because it's a pretty immediate effect. It doesn't need to build up like
Hmm.
creatine, for example. So you take it, and for me, at least within about 30, 45 minutes, I feel a noticeable effect.
Wow.
I remember the first time I took it, I felt, I wouldn't say euphoric or anything like that, but I was I was very stressed constantly about everything. So on a Saturday, I would want to be working and uh, ended up just taking a trip, just like a day trip. And usually I'd be thinking like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that, and all that, and I'd be constantly stressed and not be able to enjoy it fully. And I took this rhodiola for the first time, and the whole day I just felt great, like just very
Wow.
detached from my stress in general. Just okay. I mean, I'll get to it. It's not to the point where I'm apathetic, but I'm just like I'm cognizant, but it's just something I'll do later, and I'll take care of it. And I'm not going to let it like bother me, emotionally. So that was my experience with it. Then I did give it to a friend of mine who was also going through a really stressful period, and he also noticed a significant effect from it as well. And then I recommended it to someone else, and they also had a great effect from it. So
Wow.
that's all anecdote. I'm a scientist, so I don't buy too much into that stuff. So ultimately, I looked at the studies. I tried to pull together every study I could find on stress and anxiety, and the studies are absolutely, I won't cuss, but like just dog crap. I mean,
Yeah.
horrible, just horribly done. Um, and it's actually the statistics about the studies that are completely off. So there's maybe one or two well done studies, and they do still corroborate the results of the badly done studies as well. So based on limited evidence, it does seem that rhodiola rosea does reduce feelings of stress and does help with burnout and may help with sleep, although I think that's kind of a secondary outcome, but definitely anxiety and stress. It seems like the evidence is partially leaning in the direction of it helping.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, it's interesting. I've not, like I said, looked too much into it. Because of, I don't know, like it's funny because here people hear me talking about rapamycin, and in a recent podcast I was talking about finasteride, and so you could get this sense that like I'm just trying to take whatever I can, and I'm really not that person. I know I've seen some people's lists of supplements, and it's just staggering what they take. I don't take pretty much anything that I mean, that I haven't looked up quite a bit that has clear evidence for it. And so in general, if I can get the same effect from just some sort of natural, quote unquote, natural means, I do try to do that. But like so for this, if I was really stressed, maybe I'd say, hey, I don't know, meditate, mindfulness practice, whatever. But the other argument there is if it is a pretty benign substance and there's not really a risk of much with side effects, why not take something to your advantage during a time when you need it? Like if you had this particularly stressful period, why not take it? So maybe it's something that I would consider in the future. Are you buying like any specific formulation of it? Is it just like an over-the-counter version or Amazon?
I just went to Consumer Labs and looked up what they had tested. They found that Blue Bonnet was the one that, and it's pretty cheap. I'm not taking it anymore, just to be clear, after my PhD, because like you, I'm exactly the same as you in that regard. I don't like taking a ton of supplements. I have a few like omega-3s and creatine and maybe a few others that I take just because they have so much efficacy and so many studies behind them. So I might as well take them. But I'm not a huge fan of taking like just gobs and gobs of supplements. So I stopped taking it, but it's not because it doesn't work. It's just because I'm not stressed anymore.
Yeah, right, right. Cool. So this is more of like a general topic here. So just with I actually had to make a video on there was a Dr. Mike Israetel, and then he
Oh,
was with Dr. Mike, the like a celebrity doctor, and they were talking about
okay.
something. So I want to make a video on that. But Mike Israetel, I've seen now a number of times. He's very optimistic in terms of the future of health and AI and medicine. Basically, I mean, he's said some wild things to me in terms of thinking like 5 to 10 years from now, you're basically going to get to decide if you die. Like that level of optimism, like with where health is going, which I'm sure is a very small minority of people feel that strongly. Conversely, somebody like Atia, who obviously his whole life now is dedicated to longevity and all of that, uh, thinks that we're not even really going to extend lifespan that much, maybe ever, maybe like in foreseeable future, and that, hey, maybe you can add 10 years, but it's mostly about making sure the quality of life is really there. And I think that's, I mean, if you were to ask me my genuine opinion, I would say it's probably more that, the latter opinion there. But I'd love to believe that, we're going to have these major advances. One of my thoughts sometimes is like, we're so fortunate in that we have so many advances in healthcare and in technology and everything now. But I also make the analogy of if you imagine like you were born and you died of polio, and it was like 2 years before the polio vaccine happened. It's like, man, we were right there. You were right there. And I feel like we are like right on the cusp of some amazing things that's probably not going to be there, maybe in our lifetime. But if you were to go like 200 or 300 years from now, you're like, man, like that just some pretty crazy advances. And I feel a little bit more strongly about that now than I did when I see the advances of AI because, and just technology in general. Because if I just imagine human capacity, I imagine, yes, we're going to see still exponential growth for a time. Um, but when I see the advances in technology and again in AI and whatnot, and how it is able to just multifold increases over a short period of time, I just find it very fascinating. So obviously, this wouldn't be necessarily your area of expertise or anything, but just speculation. What are your thoughts on like the future of medicine and health and technology there?
Well, I'm definitely incredibly bullish on the idea of AI. I'm not as bullish as Mike Isertail.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild claim. I don't think we're anywhere near that level of research to be able to like cure aging or to dramatically affect aging beyond. I mean, to our credit, to humanity's credit, you mentioned it like polio, for example, like what 100 years ago, a little bit over 100 years ago, we were dying much earlier because of like infections and in childbirth and all these different things. And the fact that we've just eradicated some of these conditions is just like a crowning achievement of medicine. It's truly unbelievable. Dental health. Hey, I mean that's another
Yeah,
huge
yeah,
one, right?
right.
That's one that's made massive leaps and bounds, and I'm I'm always like, yeah, I'm in awe of what humans have done in that regard. I think we need to appreciate that a little bit more because it's just such doom and gloom that I see all the time on social media. I guess negativity sells more or just is more attractive for people. But I'd like to just point out that humanity's done some incredible things. And I think AI is going to be another one of those incredible things. I don't know how to gauge the actual impact, but beyond, I do think it's going to be positive. I think it's going to be, or I should say, a net positive. There may be some negatives for sure in relation to medicine. Uh, I I've been using it. So for my study analyses, I use, some like basic large language model systems like ChatGPT 4 and whatnot, just to help me like essentially collate like the study design and things like that. And what's really nice now, if anybody's interested on Adobe, they have a little AI assistant and it works pretty well. You can just ask it like, what's the study design? You can ask it like, what's the length of the study? Give me the participant characteristics, things like that. And it'll just populate it. And what I really love about it is that it gives you a link to where it got that information in the study, and it'll just like teleport you to that section, which is really helpful because then I get to double check if it's actually correct. Um, so it's certainly sped up my processing for study analysis because I've got a checklist of what I check for every single study that I read to
Hmm.
make sure that they hit these different markers, and it helps me just fly through it. So I've been really pleased with that. It certainly makes mistakes from time to time, and that's just the way it is. But if that continues to improve, I think that it's going to speed up our ability to do research. And I forgot the name of it, but there's like the folding of proteins and whatnot. I think that there's this particular AlphaFold. I think that's what it's called. Um, this system that researchers use in structural biology, which is another type of biology, where they're essentially, it's to me, it's in on one aspect, it's incredibly fascinating. On another aspect, it's just like incredibly boring. But it's if you're looking at, let's say, hemoglobin, the hemoglobin molecule, you can have a researcher that's dedicated to learning how hemoglobin interacts with oxygen. Like how does the sub proteins of this protein interact molecularly with oxygen? They can spend like a decade of their life working on just that little interaction.
Yeah, yeah.
And now with AI, we have these the way structural biology works to a degree is that you have these predictions that the researchers put out in papers, and they try to confirm it through these actual experiments known as um, electron microscopy. It's a type of electron microscopy. It's a type of microscope work where they freeze the sample in place and cryo EM. So they freeze the sample in place, and then they take images of it and try to figure out like the actual composition and whatnot. So that kind of stuff, the actual modeling and the actual predictions have just been blasted into a stratosphere in terms of the speed by which researchers can now predict what a protein is going to do. Um, and if anybody's interested, the reason why we do this stuff is because we want to understand, for example, well, one, we want to just understand how our biology works down to a sub like molecular unit, but also because we want to understand how like drugs can interact with a particular protein. Let's say if you wanted hemoglobin to be more efficient, for example, well, we would have to understand how it actually functions, how it folds together. So that kind of research has already been massively impacted by AI, and I'm really excited for what we can do in the future. And in terms of Atia versus Israel, I don't know. I lean a little bit more towards the Atia side as well, mainly because we have to separate out, lifespan from health span. And health span, we've made some incredible advancements. We've made advancements in lifespan as well, as like we were talking about with infections and whatnot from 100 plus years ago. But yeah, I think that AI overall is going to be a pretty great thing.
Yeah, I would imagine that that's where, I mean, because obviously, years back, when they sequenced the genome and then they kind of thought like CRISPR was going to be like, revolutionary and everything was going to kind of be solved. And then that kind of wasn't exactly how it worked. But it seems like more and more they are, they're still continuing to explore that whole, I guess, method of improving health, like different gene manipulation and whatnot. And I think as there's increased clarity there, they might have better success. Like, so for example, you're familiar with myostatin, and like, so there were these myostatin inhibitors that came out, and or at least like even like in underground labs, like the guys that were using steroids and whatnot, the people were selling quote unquote myostatin inhibitors, and who knows what they were actually doing, but with that in the mice models and whatnot, they have increased cardiovascular risk, and so it's not like, hey, you can just take this myostatin inhibitor and now you're just going to be jacked and have no side effects and everything. But maybe over time they'll be able to manipulate that, probably not for bodybuilding purposes, but for like, like cancer patients and AIDS patients and whatnot who have this muscle wasting issue. And they'll be, I mean, that's where a lot of the research, even on anabolics, came from, right? And so being able to manipulate specific genes that can turn on and off, basically various problems that arise from other manipulations. Obviously, that's pretty advanced, and I just would wonder. Like, I almost think of like Tony Stark with like Marvel, and he's got this whole like 3D image up, and it's like, well, what happens if we do this, and just run a simulation? And
Yeah,
right now, that seems pretty far-fetched. But if you can get to a point where it's like the technology genuinely just understands and almost has a replica of a human body synthesized electronically, where it's like, what happens when we do this? Oh, this is created. And what happens if we do that? And again, right now it seems like this super futuristic idea, but given how the technology is evolving, I wouldn't be surprised if that is eventually a way that you can test. And then even going beyond that, instead of having, I mean, how many times, like, I've even wondered this with fitness, where it's like, man, I wish we could just have 100 people do, like, this type of training, and 100 people do this type of, like, this routine, and we just have to see it. We don't have to like guess, or 1,000 people, whatever. And if you have this theoretical model I'm thinking of, just, hey, just put this stimulus in, and what was the result? Put this medication effects in, and what was the result? And study clarity would become so much greater, because, and not that this would take the place of like true randomized controlled trials, but just in the sense that it would, it would almost be in the sense of, like, if you think of yourself, you take a supplement, you get, let's say, crazy anxiety. It kind of doesn't matter if you have 100 studies that say that anxiety is not a side effect. If that's what happens to you, right? Like, I mean, as much as n equals one is not so relevant to other people, for you, it is the most relevant, right? And so in a sense, if you had some replica of yourself, even with technology, you don't have to guess about how it's like, hey, how is cancer treatment going to affect this simulation, and how's it going to affect this? Anyway, obviously, I'm just extrapolating and thinking of a million things, but it's a fascinating thing to think about eventually getting there.
it is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the biggest limitation is actually data. Like, can we collect enough data? Because no AI can function, nothing can function without sufficient data. And I think that science, as many as progressive as it's been, many leaps and bounds that it's made, our ability to collect data is really our limiting factor. And when you're talking about human beings that have so much complexity about them, once you insert AI that has the bandwidth to be able to just suck up mass amounts of data, and then start to get into that granularity of like, okay, well, this one person has this slightly different blood sugar relative. It's just like so many networks of analysis that could occur. And, but again, the limitation is the actual data input. And that's I think, going to be an area that we're going to have to work on for sure.
Yeah, super interesting. So,
Yeah, it
all right,
is.
man. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Like I said, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm sure
Me
we'll
too.
have some more in the future as well.
Yeah.
And I really encourage anybody listening to check out Nick's channel. My understanding is you are basically going to be doing YouTube full time, right?
Yeah, yeah. Currently, the idea. I mean, I love teaching. I taught for a while at two universities, so I'd like to eventually maybe just do adjunct. Just teach like one class a week. That would be a lot of fun. But beyond that, like in terms of like my actual income and my life, yeah, Physionic. I'd like to grow that as much as I can as a business, ethically, of course, ethical
Yes.
business.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome, man. So of course we'll have links below. So you kind of just said it, but where can people find specifically your work?
Just type in physionic. That's spelled like physio, like you go to physiotherapy, and then NIC. Just tack those together, and you got it. It'll show
Awesome.
up for sure.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.